Uh, Welcome and good morning to everyone who is accessing from Europe, and good afternoon to everyone who is accessing from Japan. We have simultaneous interpretation. Please feel free to choose between Japanese to English or English to Japanese by pressing the interpretation button on your Zoom screen. There's also a chat function, so if you have any questions, please feel free to send us a chat. I'm the moderator for this webinar, Mariko Mia, a cybersecurity analyst and a consultant at a private cybersecurity services company in Japan called KeyConnect. Japan and the EU are essential partners. Since 2019, they have engaged in a new, more profound form of partnership called the Strategic Partnership Agreement, or SPA. This agreement promotes deeper political relations and more intense cooperation and joint actions in a wide range of policy areas, from energy and climate change to economic and financial policy to security and defense to people connectivity and others. The leaders have recently reaffirmed their commitment to the strategic partnership in the belief that both Japan and the EU will play an important role in recovering from the effects of the global pandemic. The webinar series on COVID-19 puts in practice the principles expressed by the leaders. This virtual forum provides space to exchange information and views about the EU and Japan's responses to the crisis, and to discuss ideas for enhancing EU-Japan cooperation in the context created by the new virus. The series began 3 weeks ago with a discussion on COVID-19 and green recovery. Recovery strategies must focus on rebuilding robust, sustainable, inclusive, and resilient economies in line with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. Recovery strategies must put at the center decarbonization of the economy, digital transformation, and the virtuous cycle of environment and growth. In today's webinar on COVID-19 and digitalization, we will discuss the impacts of COVID-19 on digitalization in general, as well as the EU and Japan's digital response to tackle the pandemic, including the use of digital tools such as contact tracing. We will also explore how the EU and Japan can work together on data and ensure that new technologies meet data privacy standards. We have very little time to discuss such a broad theme, and we most likely will not be able to answer every question from the audience. Let's jump right in. Will the speakers please introduce yourselves briefly along with your experience with work from home during the COVID-19 crisis? It could be a personal experience as well as how your organization is dealing with work from home or remote working environments. Starting with the EU side, Mr. Gerald de Graaf, could you please introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody in Europe, and good afternoon, everybody who has joined in Tokyo. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. It's also very nice to see our very good friends from Tokyo, and particularly Fukunaga-san. I am director in DG Connect, which is the Directorate General that deals with technologies in the European Commission. I'm responsible for the strategy development and implementation at the EU side, and that also includes a lot of regulatory aspects that we will talk about later during the webinar. How has it been to be working from home? It's been strange in a way. I mean, what I'm surprised about, because the European Commission is a very big organization and more than 30,000 people work there, how flexible, how quickly this has been kind of implemented, and it actually works, and it works quite well. I mean, the downside, and most of us, of course, are working here in Brussels, but we are from one of the other countries. And so our families are living in other parts of the European Union, and that has been quite tough. I mean, with the kind of the impossibility to travel, and of course, with the COVID crisis, I think we've all been quite concerned about the well-being of our families. But in general, it's been working really well.
Great, thank you. Next, Mr. Ivo Volman, could you please introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good morning to everyone. It's great to be part of this session. I'm head of unit data policies and innovation in the same director general as Gerard is. And my team is behind the European data strategy that was published in February. Now, as Gerard said, it's amazing how well things have worked actually during the crisis, working from home. At the same time, there are many people in my team who are complaining that the borders between work and private have broken down even more than before. So people have the feeling that they're on all the time during the crisis and that there's no time for a break.
Thank you. And Mr. Andreas Tege, would you please introduce yourself, please? I think your mic's still muted.
Yeah, hello again. This is Andreas Tege. I'm head of global public policy at SAP. For those who are not familiar with SAP, it's a global market leader for enterprise software, globally engaged, also in Japan since 30 years, quite successfully. And yes, working from home, well, similar to what my colleagues already mentioned. In the beginning, at least, I felt like, wow, no traveling, no commuting. This is almost like vacation. And also, I feel like over the last 2 months, it works extremely well, surprisingly well, when it comes to routine meetings. And I think we will not go back to personal meetings when it's all about reporting or whatever, something routine. But when it becomes sensitive, either HR matters internally or whether you need to convince people, when you negotiate, when it's sensitive, it doesn't work. So we need to go back to physical meetings for the real stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. And the Japanese side, Fukunaga-san, can you please introduce yourself, please?
Yes. So I'd like to try this in Japanese. My name is Fukunaga. Fukunaga Tetsuro is my name. I'm Director General for International Cyber Economy Policy at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. I spent 4 years in Brussels for EPA negotiations, and from that perspective, I am very much honored to be able to take part in this seminar. We can't see each other like Mr. Graf face to face, but still we can bridge this distance and still meet with each other. Thank you very much for the organizer for organizing this seminar. So talking about work style here in Japan, we had the emergency declaration, and we need to reduce the traveling or commuting to work by 70%. And my wife has not traveled to her workplace for 3 months. This is a new lifestyle. We have gotten used to this, and we have become better cooking at home as well. We use digital tools and equipment. But I do hope to have more physical thing, and we need to have an extra desk at home to set up my PC. But I was able to buy a kind of European style furniture as well. So that makes me happy. Thank you very much. Happy to see you, everyone.
Last but not least, Miyata-sensei, could you please introduce yourself, please?
Microphone is muted. Yes. Hello, everyone. I am Miyata from Keio University School of Medicine. So with COVID-19, well, at the beginning, well, I was just watching the situation from afar because policy is my area, but not the infection itself. But then I started to understand that this is going to be a community-acquired infection. Therefore, I thought that there need to be some response. Therefore, we started to work with businesses in Japan. We have an app called Line, which is equivalent to WhatsApp, and there are 83 million users in Japan of Line. And using that app, we started to do a survey. And in order to suppress infection, how can we fully utilize the technologies? That is something we started to consider together with the local governments as well as businesses. So although I'm not an essential worker, but I started to take part in such task force. That's why I could not fully stay at home. But as you know, we are now talking about new normal. And this internet or online way of work is already part of our life. This is a new lifestyle. So it's a combination of online and physical. And educational establishment as well as the businesses that are trying to explore a new normal. Thank you very much.
I'd like to repeat the interpretation button. There's an interpretation button on the Zoom screen. If you'd like to listen in English, please switch to the English to Japanese button. Okay, and shall we move on to the presentations, please? We'll start with the EU speakers, Mr. de Graaf and Mr. Tege. So, Mr. de Graaf, could you please start your presentation?
Yes. Well, I would like to start by, of course, saying that the COVID crisis has been devastating, both in Japan and in the EU and around the world. Devastating in terms of human lives. In the European Union, about 200,000 people have lost their life as a result. Some countries have been hit very hard, particularly Italy, 35,000, France, 30,000 deaths, Spain, 28,000, and the country in which we live here in Belgium, 10,000. So it's been a human tragedy. And of course, we're not yet out of the crisis. I mean, the situation clearly has improved. Lockdown has been easing, but I think we're all prepared that there might be further difficulties, and we also see, of course, in parts of the world that the virus is coming back, and so by no means we can declare victory. And the same, of course, is true in Japan. So it's been absolutely a human tragedy. Of course, linked to this is it's also been an economic tragedy. I mean, we've never seen a deeper recession in the European Union, and since the kind of the Great Recession in the 1930s, we expect a significant contraction of our economy, about 8%. I mean, lots of people have lost their jobs already. Unfortunately, there will be more to follow. We have done, as governments and member states, as much as has been possible to sustain economic activity, but still it's a terrible blow, and it will have implications for many years. We'll be dealing with the consequences of the COVID crisis for many years. Maybe it's early now to already draw lessons about what we've learned, because we're still in the middle of it, and there's undoubtedly still a lot that we have to learn. But I think what we have learned, particularly from the perspective of digitalization, I think are probably three lessons already. One is that digital has been indispensable. I mean, if our economies and our societies have been able to kind of continue and social economic life has sustained, I mean, also the way we can interact, it is thanks to digital. I mean, think back, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, if this would have happened, I mean, how would our economies and societies have kind of been able to hold up? So clearly digital has been indispensable, and the digital revolution will only be accelerated. It was already kind of transforming relatively fast in Europe. It will go even faster, and this will have important implications as well. So that's lesson number one. Lesson number two is that, of course, also our weaknesses have been exposed, where digital has helped us to work. In some parts of the European Union, clearly, we are not yet well prepared. The connectivity isn't there. Companies that suddenly had to switch over to go online to be able to continue to reach their customers. I mean, these were not prepared. A lot of companies were not ready to switch their business model from like the offline to the online world. We had schools or universities that were not immediately equipped to change their teaching methods to go online. There were students that didn't have the equipment at home, so couldn't join, which is of course a major social problem. People didn't have the appropriate skills. I mean, I heard that Fukunaga-san learned better how to cook. I learned better how to use these type of video conferencing facilities. I mean, 3 months ago, I would have been unable, even though I work in a technology DG. I've learned a lot. I've acquired a lot of digital skills because I had to, and I think that's true for a lot of people. So the weaknesses have been exposed, and obviously they need to be addressed. I think the third thing that we have learned in Europe, and probably also others around the world, is that we've become too dependent. We need to, we've had, and this is not just in the medical supplies, we all followed how difficult it was to get ventilators and personal protective equipment and drugs, etc., because they were kind of not manufactured in the European Union. We had to import them, and that was difficult under the circumstances. But also in technology, supply chains, etc., got severely disrupted as a result of kind of all the disruptions in the trading system, in the way that goods and services could circulate. So clearly there is greater attention than there was even before for what we call the concept of strategic autonomy. The European Union needs to be able to stand on its own feet in these times of crisis. And of course work very, very closely. This is not about protectionism, but work very, very closely with like-minded partners. And Japan absolutely is, of course, a very, very important strategic partner. So this is also an issue that we will need to discuss with our Japanese friends, how to kind of make sure that not only in times of crisis, but more generally, that the EU and Japan, particularly in technology, can have the capacity to be more autonomous. So those would be the kind of introductory remarks that I would like to make.
Thank you. Mr. Takeya, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm supposed to talk a little bit about the COVID-19 tracing app, our experience especially in Germany, and the question of European and international interoperability of those apps. So starting with the experience in Germany, like in many other countries, it was in the middle of the crisis, sometimes perhaps in March, it was understood, okay, such a tracing app could be one of the key instruments to disrupt the chain of infections. So everybody was keen on, okay, we need something like this. But when the development of the app started in Germany, there were lots of controversial debates on, is it secure? What about data privacy? And when they looked abroad, the initial experience in Austria and other markets, it was not really promising. It was no social acceptance or little social acceptance. It didn't really work sometimes. So, and then it didn't really help that the initial experience in Germany with the first development team did not really deliver the results that the government expected. So that was in April, not really promising. And that was a time when we at SAP and Deutsche Telekom were asked, well, rescue the project, develop the app. So the starting point was challenging, also because the government put a tough deadline on the table because there were already delays in Germany for the app. So we were asked to finish the project in mid-June, so just a couple of weeks to develop the app. The good news, though, was since we were a bit late in Germany, we could learn from lessons from other markets. And that was the starting point at SAP. We did a comprehensive analysis globally on lessons learned in other markets. And then, the app was successfully launched on June 16th. And now, of course, it's only 2 or 3 weeks, but I think it's regarded as a success. We have about close to 15 million downloads. That's about almost a third of all smartphones in Germany. Very little flaws, and most importantly, there's social acceptance for the app. Now, how did we get there? I mean, I think there were 3 lessons or 3 areas where we really focused on, based on lessons learned from other markets. Number 1, openness. So we decided from the very beginning, this must be an open source project where the public could, take a look at the whole development process. Actually, there were 107,000 people who looked at the app, and many participants throughout the process. So openness was very important, the transparency to get public acceptance for the app. Second point was user experience. Not only in terms of the operation of the app. So for example, we use the Apple, Google API so that you can use the app passively, you can work on other apps, so that was very important from a user experience. But first and foremost, of course, data privacy, because of the concerns that were out there before. So we put, I think, every safeguard in place that is doable. Then, of course, compromising features that perhaps the health authorities would have liked to have, which are not available. But these safeguards were quite important. And also we worked with the Data Privacy Office of the German government from the very beginning, with the security agency. So I think it's fair to say these are the highest standards for data privacy such an app can have, again, with some compromises on the health features. So, and then the third point was a sound communication strategy. From the very beginning, we put updates on where we were on the app, also to be transparent about problems, and involving data privacy officers or the health authorities. So I think the communication strategy was quite sound. All in all, I think we can say yes, there's social acceptance, and I think it's probably, at least in Europe, I would say it's the best practice for this app. The next challenge will be to establishing European and also international interoperability for these kind of apps. And this will be a challenge because it's a shame, but it's a fact. These apps were developed, at least initially, uncoordinated in Europe, right? And it reflected what happened in general in the first weeks of the pandemic, that member states had their own recovery strategy, their own COVID-19 strategy. There was very little coordination at European level. And the same happened with the COVID app. As a consequence, there are different architectures. A majority of member states are moving towards the decentralized approach in terms of storage. A few member states have, like France, have opted for a centralized approach. And a few member states have not decided at all, or decided that they don't want to use an app at all. So fragmented situation that is challenging for establishing interoperability. I must say that the European Commission has done a fantastic job in coordinating the activities, putting guidelines in place, technical specifications for interoperability. And this will now help us to do the next step. The next initial focus now is to ensure the interoperability of these apps that have chosen for a decentralized approach. So there will be pretty soon in place a European gateway server that will connect those apps. And as far as I understand, SAP and Deutsche Telekom will be chosen to develop this app. And the deadline for this is the 1st of September. So by then, at least, I would say 10 markets, 10 member states will be able to connect those apps so that, for business travelers or for tourism especially, that should work. And then the next step is, of course, to try as much as possible to ensure interoperability with the centralized approach. And then, of course, at least we at SAP, we would be very open for third countries. That is interoperability, to ensure that the European interoperability framework is open to third countries like Japan. And final point, we at SAP would very much welcome European and perhaps a global platform where app providers can exchange best practices. You may say, well, in 6 or 9 months from now, hopefully we don't need this app anymore, but nobody knows how long this will take. And probably this would also be a nice platform for the next shock. That will probably come. So we would very much welcome, first of all, a close cooperation between the EU and Japan in this area, and perhaps among app providers as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have the Japanese speakers. Fukunaga-san, お願いします。
ありがとうございます。
Fukunaga-san, please. Yes, thank you very much. Mr. De Graaf spoke about the impact on the economy and what digitalization can and should bring about to the society. That is something that I totally agree with that. So I'd like to give you some reflections on the situation in Japan. In Japan, digitalization was accelerated. In the past, it was quite slow to come. In this era of digitalization, I think that was a big impact that COVID-19 brought about to Japan. Digital transformation, or DX, has become a buzzword here in Japan. Everyone is talking about DX. For instance, remote healthcare or online education, telework, which were very slow to come in Japan, have now made so much progress. And there are many challenges which can be solved by digitalization. Momentum is there. For instance, supply chain has had a disruption. And finally, Japan is now talking about using blockchain technology in order to address those challenges in supply chain. This can be an initiative ASEAN-wide, or this is an initiative in the auto industry. And also with digital twin, what is physical can now be digitalization so that we can be ready for any future challenges. That is a kind of strategy incorporated in the company's strategy everywhere. And we also have good news. The faster supercomputer, Fugaku, Mount Fuji supercomputer, that is now said to be the fastest computer in the world. Now Fugaku, this supercomputer, is already used for the analysis of COVID-19. And the importance of digitalization has been recognized in the society. On the other hand, we see certain weaknesses in Japan. European speakers spoke about strengths as well as weaknesses as well. The weakness here in Japan is there is still room for improvement in terms of the infrastructure for digitalization. Having said that, we now have Dr. Miyata with us. We have the initiative between the public and the private sector to accelerate the improvement of the digitalization infrastructure. So that's the kind of impact we are seeing in terms of digitalization here in Japan. Mr. Tege from SAC has spoken about the contact tracing app. Therefore, I'd like to show you this material just to quickly introduce the app here in Japan. As Mr. De Graaf said, I need to improve my skills for teleworking. But anyway, let's take a look at this one. In the government of Japan, in order to utilize digitalization to fight against COVID-19, we have come up with anti-COVID-19 tech team. This tech team had a kickoff on April 6th. We call it ACTT. And this meeting has members that are government ministers and IT companies and the civic tech community as well as economic organizations. And we have many projects under this team, ACTT. One of the projects under ICTT is the COCOA, which is our contact tracing app. And this was released on June 19th. And 5 million people have downloaded this app already as of now. We use API, which is Google API. And when you come to contact with somebody who is infected for 15 minutes within 1 meter distance, this is traced in this smartphone. And if the infected person is also registered, that contact is being traced and notification is sent out to the person registered, and all the data is encrypted, and no telephone number is being recorded. As Mr. Tege said, the government would not know who is infected. The name is not disclosed, so the privacy security is there. And this is exactly what Mr. Tege has said. We have this table that I wanted to show you. This is looking at what kind of contact apps are being used in different markets. Bluetooth may be used or geolocation data may be used, and privacy is being kept by some apps, and other apps may collect telephone number or geolocation. And we have different way of managing data, central server or decentralized server. In case of the decentralized server, the data is stored in the individual person's smartphone, so the government would not know the name or identification. In the case of Japan, we have Bluetooth connection. And well, if we are to talk about interoperability, I think we have a very close app in Japan that is very close to the app used in Europe. We use Apple and Google API for Japanese app. So the smartphone OS eventually can have such a contact management function. At the beginning, volunteers with open source cooperated to develop this app. That's something I wanted to let you know, which means that there was an involvement of civic tech. That is why we have Professor Miyata here today to discuss this matter together with you. And a lot of people are taking part in this webinar today. And I'm sure that everyone is very much looking forward to hearing from Professor Miyata. I'm sure there are a lot of Japanese participants here today. So let's look forward to what Professor Miyata has to say. Thank you very much. Now, Professor Miyata, would you like to present? Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for your introduction. As I said in my self-introduction, community-acquired infection, that was something we were very much afraid of. And PCR testing alone cannot trace everyone infected, which means that we needed to understand what is happening around those infected people. We have an app called Line, which is identical to WhatsApp, and we have Amazon Web Service. We work with those companies such as Line and Amazon, and we started this project with volunteers. And what we got to know as data using this app, and 83 million people responded to this survey. And we didn't have a legal foundation for having strict lockdown. This is looking at the data from France. This is a Google mobility report. In many aspects, France had a very strict lockdown. Stay-home order was very strong. On the other hand, here in Japan, in terms of transit stations usage, there was a reduction. However, when it comes to retail and recreation, such as restaurants, there wasn't much reduction. And on Thursdays and also on Fridays, the level was just as usual. So this was not a good response to infectious disease. We were worried about it. So 83 million users, we conducted the survey to see what is the impact of such measure. Fever and also dullness or fatigue or shortness of breath. Of course, these symptoms do not suggest immediately COVID-19, but sales workers and food business people, the risk of fever was much higher than the risk of usual people. And those people who stay at home, they didn't have a higher risk of having a fever, even if the area they stayed had a higher risk. So, of course, stay-at-home measure works against any infection. But as long as we have a good risk management, we can probably avoid having a very strict lockdown. So that is something we started to discuss in Japan. This is looking at the spread of infection here in Japan. We are looking at the reproduction number, and this is a Google mobility report. We are looking at the correlation between the two indicators. So going to park, going to a shop, there was no correlation. From early on, people started to wear masks. So that was a very good response in Japan. And as long as you wear a mask and keep social distancing, going to a shop or store was not a very serious risk. But eating or going to a restaurant, in March, there was no lockdown. You will have to take off mask when eating. And such activities and the reproduction number correlation factor was around 0.8, which means we needed to have some response to address this issue of people going out to eat in a restaurant. So while keeping the social activities, we can still avoid a lockdown. So that's something we explored here in Japan. So there are two learnings from the release of lockdown across different markets. And this is something we knew from the Beijing and South Korea and elsewhere. Unless you have risk management or risk prevention, the infection starts to spread once again. There is a resurgence because there are people out there who are not tested, who are not having symptoms, but still who can infect. That is a characteristic of COVID-19. And in Germany, as well as in EU, as long as you have an effective lockdown and effective response to infectious disease spread, then the spread is not that rapid. As long as you have a good risk management, you can avoid having a lockdown. That can be a scenario. And then that is very important, and we need to have data for that. That's why we are collecting data in cooperation with the government. So contact tracing app, that's been already discussed. We now have such app. We developed it together with Apple and Google. Open source development practiced in Germany, I respect such an approach very much, while protecting privacy of the people. Because we are democracy, we have to be able to utilize information as much as possible. That is a kind of a concept, common concept between EU and Japan. And the Google app is going to incorporate contact tracing on the level of operating system. They have announced it already, which probably makes it easier for us to have interoperability. We need to have international cooperation for that. How can we share information and data? And how can we have cross-border activities? This is what is called Zacomont project. I am a member of that global project. And this is a kind of activity that can be pursued in the international cooperation. So PCR testing is important, but behavior to avoid risks is also very important. So that way we can continue to have economic activities while preventing the spread of infection. That is something we would like to work together with the EU. Thank you very much, Professor Miyata.
Bring up one question. As was mentioned in the presentations, interoperability of contact tracing apps are becoming more important and is to be discussed. I'd like to open a discussion on what do you think would be the biggest challenges in making this cross-border interoperability work for contact tracing apps. Would anybody like to start? Perhaps Mr. de Graaf, would you like to make a comment on what would be the biggest challenge to make contact tracing apps interoperable with third countries, like as in the EU and Japan?
Well, I was actually hoping for Mr. Tager to intervene or Ivo Roman, so that's why I was kind of holding off on clicking on the unmute button. But I think first, I mean, we still have challenges within the EU. And we don't have full interoperability. I mean, I don't know yet which app I should download. I mean, should I download the Dutch app? Will it work here in Belgium? Will it work in Germany? I think nobody knows. So that's not to say we shouldn't work already now, because these things, of course, I mean, once apps are kind of, well down the road, it becomes more difficult to kind of retroactively then make them interoperable. These are the kind of things you need to think about when you put the whole app and the functionalities together. So it's definitely wise and necessary to engage with Japan, and we are ready to engage with Japan and bring the experts together, including obviously member states and the industry, but we also have this other challenge that kind of if the app isn't even interoperable within Europe, then making it interoperable with Japan, also the added value will be fairly limited, because then the Japanese app may work in Germany, but if you go from Germany to France, it won't help you very much. But on the technical aspects, I mean, that's obviously where we will need to rely on the experts. I mean, and Mr. Tegge and SAP, I mean, they are leading a lot of the work in Europe. And of course, our contribution is to make sure that it fits in with the regulatory framework, and the data privacy, the security, obviously, are immensely important.
Yeah, if I may add, I think I would point to three probably action points. Number one, as here in Europe, I think the low-hanging fruit is try to establish interoperability between those countries that have chosen like Japan and like many European countries that have chosen the decentralized approach. Because it's very difficult to ensure interoperability, as we learned here in Europe, between the centralized and decentralized approach. I think the basic for interoperability between Japan and many European countries are there. And I think we will learn a lot over the next 2 months until September to ensure the interoperability between the decentralized apps within Europe. And I think that could be the starting point then to start the discussions also with Japan to do exactly the same. I think, I'm not the technology expert, I think it's doable. Secondly, I think we should also establish a collaboration between the app providers, Japan and Europe. For that purpose, we at SAP have suggested that we also have a forum in Europe of app providers, and then why not invite the Japanese colleagues at least perhaps to one session to start the dialogue also among the providers who actually needs to implement it, right? And thirdly, more forward-looking, this hit us all by surprise. And that's why it's not coordinated at this stage. But maybe we want to start working bilaterally, but also perhaps in the OECD. We see, okay, can we establish a reference architecture globally where we then pick and choose from when the next shock will come? That's some ideas.
Great, thank you so much. In this case, would GDPR would be a problem, or would it be a good standard for the countries that have the adequacy agreement?
Maybe Miyata-san might have a comment.
宮田先生お願いします。はい。
Apple と Google のこの
Apple and Google based contact tracing app. I think this is very compliant with GDPR. I think this is a very good way, paying good attention to privacy as well. And this is not centralized. This is stored only in the terminal of the individual. Therefore, interoperability between Germany and Japan, I think it's very high. As long as this app is on the operating system, I'm sure there will be good interoperability. So how to send out notification from the authorities to individuals? That is something we have to think about. Each country's contact tracing app can be downloaded, and then we have to think about how to operate it. So as long as we have Apple and Google-based contact tracing app, I'm quite certain that interoperability will work. So I share totally the same view with Teige-san. And talking about centralized versus decentralized, there aren't many European countries which uses this, but South Korea, Taiwan, and China using GPS information in Asia. So they have taken a bolder step forward. How can we work with those countries? That is a challenge we need to address going forward. So each country has a different policy. Synchronizing contact apps between Japan and Germany, that will work. But what about PCR negativity certificate? And how can we implement risk management? Such a stepwise information sharing needs to be addressed among those countries in order to step up economic activities. That has to be done in parallel. Privacy and infectious disease management, each country has a different policy. Therefore, respecting local policy while having some minimum common ground, that is something we need to think about. Fukunaga-san, please.
多分ご質問にあった GDPR と関係ってはそれは
About GDPR?
お願いしたいと思うんですが。
Yes, we can ask EU people to answer that question. But as Miyata-san has already touched upon, let me say this. Between Japan and the EU, as Tege-san said already, system-wise, we have a lot of commonalities already. We can tap into such commonalities. And in terms of legal framework, we have a framework for the GDPR adequacy decision that can be fully utilized as well. That way, we can probably secure interoperability or compatibility. As Professor Miyata said, we can think of a common system to be developed as a further step between EU and Japan. EU officials, I often talk about this kind of thing with EU officials. How can we address this challenge? How can we fully utilize personal information? How to respond to the security of personal information? So let's have good cooperation between EU and Japan. Let's have it on our agenda. Thank you.
Would anybody else like to comment on this theme, or shall we move on?
Maybe just to clarify, because I saw there was a question, what about GDPR, and is that important for the EU in the context of the country with which it would work to establish interoperability? The answer to that question is obviously yes. I mean, I think the GDPR is for us, I mean, Mr. Tege said social acceptance. I mean, we're not going to get kind of European users to download apps or to kind of, when they don't trust that their personal data is adequately protected, and that's true within the EU, but it's even more true when they travel to third countries. I mean, we are definitely ready, and I think as a follow-up to this webinar, we need to see how this can be made operational to intensify cooperation on the tracing apps with Japan. It's also something that has already been discussed at a high level between the EU and Japan over the last few days and weeks. So there's clearly a willingness. We maybe need to go even further, because we've used technology a lot also in the analysis. I mean, we've used supercomputing facilities in the European Union, AI in the European Union, to see how this could contribute to addressing the pressing problems that the COVID crisis has thrown upon us. And so there is probably a much wider scope of cooperation where we share our kind of a lot of data, a lot of kind of analysis that we've done, and go beyond, therefore, the cooperation on the tracing apps, however important that is, particularly when, of course, travel recommences, because at the moment there's not a lot of kind of people from Japan or coming to Europe, or from Europe coming to Japan, but hopefully that will improve in the weeks to come and in the months to come.
Thank you, Mr. Dickoff. I think we should close this question and move on to the second part of our presentations, and then maybe come back to some of the questions later if we have some time. So, Mr. de Graaf, would you like to start your presentation?
Yes, I can. I mean, maybe first, because we talked about tracing apps, I just wanted to clarify, we've also used technology a lot in other areas. I mean, we've used AI and contributed to hospitals' AI, for example, to do the triage, to decide, because of course our ICU, intensive care unit capacity was under a lot of stress in quite a few member states. So the decision whom to treat and whom to kind of help in the ICU and whom could be kind of taken care of in the more normal medical care in the hospitals. It's an important decision, and that's where we used AI, for example, where we talked a lot about, and Miyata-san talked a lot about using mobility data to see like how people were complying with, which were quite tough lockdown situations in the EU. We've kind of helped and also promoted the manufacturing of cleaning robots, so in hospitals and in other public places. So there's been a lot of like technology. Euro HPC, our high performance computing network in the European Union. I mean, Fukunaga-san talked about high performance computing, also has been very active in finding already existing drugs that could help address symptoms of COVID. And with some success, we found one medication, one drug that is used for osteoporosis that actually has some quite at least promising effects to deal with kind of the beginning symptoms of COVID. So technology has been really kind of deployed as much as possible. But maybe I could say some kind of wider things than about the health, the economy. I mean, the European Union, obviously, I mean, we've had and we are still in a tremendous economic shock. So what the EU together with the member states have done is to make sure that we do have the capacity also in terms of financial resources to absorb the shock and to also then to rebuild our economies, to recover and make our economies more resilient. I mean, the figures, I mean, this is about trillions, 2.4 trillion euros. I mean, it's very hard to imagine how much that is, but it's an awful lot of money. Using the EU budget, also the EU, which is kind of for the first time, the Commission, if there is an agreement of heads of state and government, will go onto the capital market and borrow money that can then be used for a recovery fund, some 750 billion euros. And what is important there is that we don't just want to recreate or re-establish the economy which we all know before the crisis. We want to use this kind of almost existentialist crisis to really renew our economy, to make sure that the ambitions that we have in Europe and that are largely shared also by Japan to make our economies green, to make our economies digital, and so come out of the crisis stronger than the economy that we had when we got into the crisis. And that's like, it's a big and bold ambition. It requires a lot of funding. It also requires a lot of structural reforms. It's not just a matter of just pouring money into kind of investments. It's also making sure that our single market works. That's where we have a whole program, and Mr. Volman will talk about how we want to transform the EU in a data-driven economy. We talk a lot about protection of data. One thing I've always learned, particularly from my discussion with Fukunaga-san, is you need to also extract the value from the data. You need to share it, you need to kind of innovate around the data, develop new business models. I think that is now very much center stage in the European Union. We need to make the digital single market work. We need to massively upskill our population. If it accelerates, and we know AI is coming and big data is coming and cybersecurity is very important and there's blockchain and all these other technologies. I mean, we need to have a workforce that is able to work with these technologies. We also need to have the population who is kind of has the basic digital skills to function in a digital society, because if we don't, we will have a major kind of digital divide in the European Union. A digital divide between countries, a digital divide between kind of generations, a digital divide between kind of people who are better off and people are less off, maybe even a gender digital divide. That's not what Europe is about. Europe is about inclusion. So we need to make sure that everybody can come along in this digital transformation. That also requires massive upskilling and training. I mean, hundreds of millions of people will need to be trained and upskilled in the European Union in a very short period of time, because it's all happening very fast. We need to remove obstacles. We need to get real public services that are kind of high quality. One of the problems we had is that some member states e-government didn't work well enough. So you couldn't go to the town hall. If you needed a certificate or a piece of paper and e-government didn't work, that's not acceptable. That has to change. We need to work around kind of, I mean, we want to roll out 5G very quickly, but there's still a lot of red tape with permits and processing, etc. So there's a whole reform program which we need to implement in the European Union. And that has to be done very quickly. The key word at the moment in the European Union is front loading. If we have these funds, the funds need to get into the economy very quickly. We need to kind of create jobs. We need to make sure we need to modernize. We need to make smart cities in the European Union, smart energy systems, smart mobility systems, making sure we have waste, kind of most sophisticated waste and recycling facilities in the European Union, so that we bring digital and green together as well. So that's a huge challenge for us. I mean, for the whole of the EU, for the population, for the businesses, for the policymakers, for the EU as a whole. But we have no choice but to succeed in that challenge, because the alternatives, we will kind of be in a crisis for a very long time, and we will lose our standard of living and our prosperity, and we will lose our influence in the world. And that is absolutely not something that the European Union is willing to accept. So it's a very bold, and we need everybody on board, and we need to cooperate with partners like Japan, because we cannot do it alone. We absolutely, more than ever, need international and multilateral cooperation.
Thank you for your strong message. Shall we, is it Mr. Bowman's presentation?
Yeah, no, thanks.
Okay.
I'm going to talk about data.
Okay.
Right, now the crisis has shown the importance of data, I think, to everyone, because aren't we all glued to our screens to see what happens in the different regions, to see what happens in terms of the number of people who get the COVID in the different countries, right? And at the same time, we see the importance of data that has really been very important in taking decisions. A lot of decisions have been data-driven, more than ever. At the same time, the crisis has shown a huge number of problems of sharing data. A very concrete example, when people went from the Netherlands to Germany because there were not enough places in the Dutch intensive care, there was a problem with sharing the patient data among countries. So data, hugely important, but also we see there are a number of problems. Now, moving forward, as Gerard has already mentioned, data can play a key role in our recovery strategy. Why? Because data is the basis for a huge range of new products and services. Data is also at the basis of efficiency gains in all the industries across the board. And of course, data is also important because it will help us to live healthier lives. It will help us to make a greener economy. It will help us to make transport more efficient, and it will help us for better policy making. Now, that's why I think that the data strategy that we brought out in February 2020, this year, it seems ages ago actually, is more important than ever. Now, the strategy presents the vision of a common European data space. What do we mean by that? It's a common European market where there's a lot of data available, where the data can flow amongst countries, between countries and between sectors, where the values, European values, in particular privacy, are fully respected, and where there are clear rules and arrangements for data sharing, data access and use. But of course we realize that, well, you cannot completely compare health data with manufacturing data. They're different, right? So that's why we also introduced the concept of common European data spaces, where we're going to look at a sectoral level, whether we can combine data infrastructures, the machines, with data governance, the rules and agreements between partners. Now, with the data strategy, we would like more data to become available for use and to extract the value of the data. That's the core concept. So government data must be open for use by everyone. It has been paid for by the taxpayer. It should be open across all the European countries. On business to government data sharing, so the use of private sector data for public good, well, we are going to look at how we can structurally make more of that type of data available. We saw in the crisis how important it is to have the mobility data available, to have some pharma data available to combat the crisis. On business to business data sharing, well, at the moment that's not really taking off, and still there's enormous potential because there's no trust in data sharing. It doesn't take off. So we're going to see what can be done also in this area. And finally, we want to empower individuals to have more control over their data, the data they generate through their activity. Now, of course, we're looking with great interest to what's happening in Japan, all the developments. 2 examples, your work on model agreements for business to business data sharing, really important. Your work and ideas to build services on what you call information banks or personal data trusts, that there's a real important examples where we're looking to Japan as to learn. So what are we going to do in Europe in the coming years? So first of all, we're going to look at the governance framework for these common European data spaces that I mentioned to create trust in data sharing. That's a real important issue. We're going to look at making more publicly funded data available for reuse, for commercial reuse, but also non-commercial reuse. Then we're going to address the tricky issue of fairness of data use. We will do that in a Data Act that's foreseen for 2021. And then, of course, this is also about investments. We are going to invest in data infrastructures of the future, and also in these common European data spaces to make sure that things like interoperability are working. Now, of course, we're very happy to work together with like-minded countries like Japan, and that is really the best way to make data work for our economies and societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baldwin. If anybody would like to comment, please interrupt me anytime. But if there's no comments, let's move on to Mr. Tege.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I wanted to stress that I fully share the initial comments by Gerard, that meaning that we have some headwinds now, some public attention by political leaders that realize the importance of digital, that it's no longer an option, it's a must for not just economic recovery, but to make the economy more sustainable, more resilient, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we should leverage this, but because we don't know how long this attention will last, right? And that especially is true for the European data strategy and the data spaces. I think this is the time to come up with some lighthouse projects as soon as possible for issues like in the healthcare area or energy, where so far there was big potential. We have always seen the potential, but there was some hesitation among member states, governments for data sharing, et cetera, et cetera. I think now it's the time to come up with those lighthouse projects. And SAP will propose some of these projects in the coming weeks. Now, some initial thoughts, additional thoughts on priorities where perhaps the EU and Japan could work together. One is on cloud, and the second example would be on the green economy. On cloud, we at SAP realize, well, Europe is lagging behind in terms of cloud development. 2 main reasons. Number one, there are severe business user concerns about cloud use, GDPR compliance, data portability, data security, data sovereignty, et cetera, et cetera. And on the second hand, Japan doesn't have this problem. We have tremendous market fragmentation. Data localization within Europe, different public policy procurement. So as there's no opportunity to scale cloud offerings in Europe. So these are the two problems. And therefore, we at SAP have developed a proposal for a framework for secure and trustworthy cloud computing in Europe, consisting of a set of horizontal and vertical certification schemes where we can use the EU Cyber Act and ENISA to work on this. And obviously, that would make a lot of sense to collaborate with Japan on these certification schemes, because I think you may also have challenges to build trust for cloud computing. So that's one proposal. The second one is completely different, related more to the green economy. We at SAP have been asked by many customers who said, we are doing our annual sustainability report, but we would like to take into account sustainability issues in our day-to-day operations, like we do for cost or quality. So we are now working on a complete new set of software on carbon footprint tracking that will allow companies to take, whatever they do from throughout the supply chain to when they pick up supply, when they discuss a new product, that they can take into account the carbon footprint of this particular step in the supply chain into their day-to-day decisions. All good. We're doing co-innovation projects with many customers, but guess what is missing? Global accounting standards. So we're comparing apple with oranges, and it doesn't work. And I think this could be another area where Japan and EU could work together within the OECD to build this global regime for carbon accounting standards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Followed by the Japanese speakers, Fukunaga-san, お願いします。
はい、ありがとうございます。
Fukunaga-san, please. Yes. Thank you for this opportunity. I took very much interest in the presentations by EU speakers. Digital and green. These are very important elements in the recovery plan in the EU. And this is a kind of initiative that we would like to learn from here in Japan. We would like to reference to that in Japan as well. I have been in conversation with De Graaf already, Mr. De Graaf. Here in Japan, Mr. Nishimura, in charge of economic revitalization, is talking about digital New Deal, the potential of digital New Deal. Just like in Europe, we would like to have maximum economic recovery. That is very important for the entire society. And how can we use digital technology and digital transformation? We would like to fully utilize that. AI, high performance computer, or 5G technology. How can we deploy all of these technologies to create a new lifestyle, establish new society? And that is being questioned. Against this backdrop, as Mr. Bowman said, how can we utilize the data? That is really at the core of our agenda. From this perspective, the government of Japan has proposed data-free flow of trust, or with trust. Data-free flow with trust, we would like to embody this concept in order to achieve Society 5.0. That is a big direction for the Japanese government. In December 2012 already, we have advocated international framework to facilitate cross-border data flow. We have been discussing how to secure personal information and how can we securely use operational data of critical industries and 5G and IT infrastructure and cloud. How can we best use those services? We have targets for all of these items. And this has been presented by Mr. Abe at Davos meeting. He advocated data-free flow with trust. This was part of the G20 agenda last year as well. And together with other countries, we would like to establish data-free flow with trust. So what's very important is data and data flow. Importance of that has been confirmed in the framework of G20 for the first time, and the trust being the core or enabler for data share or data free flow. In order to promote data sharing, we need to have trust as the basis. And then we also need to have interoperability. This is one of the keywords today. Interoperability among different countries. This is something we need to address together. As of summer last year, Japanese government has been already working on this. How can we embody this concept? We are now working together with the EU as well in order to embody this. After the outbreak of the coronavirus, data is used more. And in this context, data-free flow with trust has gained more importance. So this G20 concept, how can we deploy this across the world? That is something we would like to work on as the government of Japan. As you can see, in the Diet of Japan, we have revised Act on Privacy. This is to promote cross-border personal data transfer further. We would like to make it easier, but at the same time, we would like to protect privacy and personal information. And we now have a new act on 5G, safe and secure 5G, to be incorporated into the infrastructure in Japan. That is not just for Japanese companies to take part in, but also European companies can take part in this. We would like to come up with incentives to promote 5G. And in May of this year, in order to secure the security of cloud, we now have a kickoff of the assessment framework on cloud. This is also the all of the government initiative. We are also promoting international cooperation. Osaka track is running. This is about 84 WTO members negotiating for e-commerce. And this is to promote data flow across the borders, and business secret and privacy also need to be secured at the same time. We'd like to come up with the rules, and that is being negotiated among 84 WTO members. We have adequacy decision with the EU already. In order to facilitate data flow across the borders, we should further promote initiatives between Japan, EU, and also the US. Privacy officials have come together since May of last year. We have had a series of meetings among these three regions. In order to further facilitate data share, we've been talking about interoperability of tracing app that has to be promoted even further. And eventually we need to have good technologies going forward. Digital technologies need to be there to respond to the changes in the society. We have to create that between the public and private cooperation. So governance innovation is something that we are initiating as well. This is to change the framework of regulations here in Japan. We have been discussing with the EU members as well as OECD countries. We would like to promote open architecture. And for that purpose, we have opened up Architecture Design Center. So all of the relevant people here, I do hope that you fully utilize Architecture Design Center in order to promote data governance or governance of innovation. So we are pursuing these initiatives, but what's next is a very important part of our discussion today. So Japanese government is trying to promote digitalization. We have seen a lot of problems about distribution masks, for instance, in Japan. We need to promote digitalization of the government for that purpose. I'm sorry about this announcement in the office in the background. So administrative work or procedure should be completed online. And for that, digital ID is very important. And we are now trying to promote such initiative. We are talking to the private sector at the same time. Gaia X is an initiative which has started in Germany. This is about the foundation to support cloud. This is a very important part of the discussion. In order to secure the cloud, the government of Japan is working for that. But at the same time, in order to improve trust of a cloud, We would like to further promote such initiative. European Common Data Space, this is an inspiration for us. In Japan, we would like to promote data sharing across different sectors, different industries. Those divided data should now be incorporated. Agriculture, automobile, road, metrological information, health data, all should be connected in a seamless manner. Before the end of this year, within the government, we would like to promote such theme in cooperation with the private sector. So data is considered very important. We would like to fully utilize the data in Japan. We are promoting it within the government of Japan. This is a challenge going forward. And this is exactly what's taking place. Digital is a common goods. It's a public goods, just like roads and other infrastructures. Japan would like to be leading in the world to fully utilize the data. And we would like to come up with those initiatives to create good infrastructure for that. So that's all from me. Thank you. Thank you, Fukunaga-san.
Last is Miyata-sensei. よろしくお願いします。
よろしくお願いします。多くの方がですね、おっしゃっていただいたように、このコロナが世界を変えるか。
Many people have said this already. Is Corona going to change the world? The damage of economy has spread across the world. We have seen a lot of deaths, but at the same time, we are seeing the advancement of digital transformation. This is a very important part of the Corona story. This will change the economy in a very fundamental manner. The data is going to change the economy entirely, as Mr. Bowman has already said. So GDPR, right to access and data portability are being promoted. Right to be forgotten. This is also an excellent concept. I'm sure this is going to be a basic human right in the 21st century. And on the extension of GDPR, we have to think about the data strategy for the entire world. On the other hand, data strategy, there are two poles, GAFA, Google, Apple, Amazon. That's business driven. And another pole is like a state-driven approach, such as a Chinese approach. And to handle data in a fair manner, that is not a mainstream yet. That is why we need to work between Japan and the EU to promote the fairness of data. As Mr. Bowman said, data is like common goods. It's a shared value at the same time. That is a very important aspect of data. We have to pay attention to the value of data. That is the core concept of data free flow with trust. Once you use oil, this is going to be depleted. So this can lead to exclusive usage. However, data can be shared by 10,000 people, 100,000 people, 1 million people, and data will never be lost. That is why we have to think about how to share data. Data shared value, data that shared value, portability and right to access. But above that, we have this concept of data being public goods. Let's establish this concept between the EU and Japan. This will bring about global impact. So economy-driven data utilization can be a challenge. Cambridge Analytica problem is one, and also GDP is one economic indicator, but this is based on possession. But people say that GDP is going to be over as a concept. So what's next? Well-being. Stiglitz has been talking about well-being as the next indicator. And this is something to do with green economy as well. We have to address sustainability. We have to think about value in the concept of sustainability. That is why we need to think about how to fully utilize the data as public goods in society. We are living in the world that is connected. We know that in this era of COVID, what to eat, how to live, how to work, that is all connected. So you can be well-being, but then it's not sustainable. That's why you have to think about better for being rather than well-being in order to create a better world. So top-down approach, this is a Chinese approach. This is probably not such a good idea. We have to think about bottom-up approach to secure well-being. And Germany is doing it with the development of application on open source basis. We have to create value and build up those value. That is very important. Data as public goods. How can we best utilize in society? That is a kind of model we would like to create between Japan and the EU. Let's work together. Let's come up with a good model and let's create a new vision for that. I'm sure that will be a very positive factor for the entire world. DFFT, data free flow with trust. I'm one of the committee member for World Economic Forum. Authorized public access is one of the discussions that's taking place, and how can we get secure access without having consent for the public value. As long as we have the record of who used what in what way, we do not have to have consent. And that is probably an idea of common platform that's being advocated by the EU. And informed consent can be connected with API among individuals, and that way, what kind of value can be brought to individuals? What kind of return society can expect? That becomes all clear. And a part of this system has been already established. By sharing activities on an individual basis, we can probably open up new usage of data. That is where we would like to work with the EU. Thank you.
宮田先生、ありがとうございます。Well, thank you
Thank
for
you, Professor Miyata.
presentations. Would anybody like to comment, or shall we move on to some questions? We have very little time until 6 o'clock.
Well, I maybe just quickly, I think what Miyata-san said is really important, because we haven't really, I think, stressed is that, I mean, it's not just about digital transformation, it is about digital transformation in a way which fits with our value systems. I mean, we're not China, you are not China, we're also not the US. It's not like the laissez-faire, as we would say, and so, I mean, we need to shape digital transformation in keeping with our values, not just kind of undergoing it, but we need to steer it in a particular direction. And that actually also gives us then competitive advantages. If people trust, if they see this is really kind of, the data is protected, this is technology for people, this is about inclusion, it's about sustainability. I mean, that's kind of, I think, what we are all about. This is what ties Japan and Europe together. We are strategic partners because we share these values. We're democracies. We're kind of believe in fundamental values. And I think that is important to bear in mind. This isn't just about technology and let's kind of catch up with China or the US and do exactly as they do. We do it in our own way, in our own kind of fashion, and in keeping with our own values. I think one thing, but probably we'll come at it a bit later. I mean, I think we now need to move to the concrete. I think there's so much we share. There's so much opportunity, as we discussed, where we can cooperate, intensify our cooperation. Our cooperation is very strong. Fukunaga-san and myself, and we've been working together for many, many years. We need to step up even more. And so what can we develop on the basis, I think, of this very interesting exchange in the webinar concretely? How can we, like over the next couple of weeks and months, identify, I think Mr. Tegger used the word also lighthouse projects, also between Japan and the EU. I think we need some lighthouse projects. And there are plenty of opportunities in data, but beyond as well. I mean, Fukunaga-san talked about digital twins. We're developing a digital twin of the Earth to see what the impact is of climate change on the Earth. Something maybe we should work together internationally. We all live on the same Earth. We are looking also at digital twins of buildings. We need a massive investment in efficiency, energy efficiency of buildings, which is one of the kind of the major emitter sources of CO2. What can we do together in this? I mean, trust services, Fukunaga-san talked about the identity, where we have a lot of experience in the European Union. Cloud was mentioned. So I think we now need to kind of go to a real operational kind of menu thing where we say, look, let's join forces and let's do it in a way which fits with our values. And then I think we can both be we can benefit tremendously from each other's experience.
Thank you, Mr. de Graaf. Unfortunately, we don't have time for any more questions. We had over 20 questions from the participants during the online registration, but we actually covered many of them. Questions include data-free flow with trust and sharing data, possibility of a trilateral agreement between the US, EU, Japan for cross-border data flow regulations, and we've already talked about Society 5.0. So it's actually close to time to close the webinar, and I would like all the speakers to give a quick concluding remark, starting with, I'm sorry, Mr. de Graaf again. Could you please say a few lines?
I don't want to kind of, I've spoken too much with you. You can see how passionate I am about it, because it's really, this is about our future. This is about, I think, the kind of the world we want to live in, our quality of life. How can we sustain our kind of unique models, our kind of solidarity in our society. So this is much more than about technology. This is about the future of our societies and obviously the competitiveness of our economies. So I am very excited. I think there's tremendous opportunities. I mean, it's a pity we need a big crisis in order to accelerate. But often, I mean, this we know in the European Union. The European Union has evolved and developed. It's the product. It's of a crisis. I mean, the Second World War and then all the breakthroughs in the European Union always came out of a crisis, unfortunately. But that's the way it is. And I think here with this crisis, let's at least turn this into a major opportunity to create a better life and to work very closely together with our strategic partners. And I mean, I think Japan is absolutely for us a very, very important partner. And I'm looking forward to kind of working with Japan around all these very exciting and interesting concepts we've discussed. And to the audience, I mean, we'll also look a bit at the questions and see whether we could answer them, but we need also your involvement. And keep kind of giving us ideas, and this has to be a collective. It can't just be government to government. We have to have all stakeholders, everybody on board to make this a success.
Thank you. Just for sake of the interpreters, I'm going to mix up the order. Fukunaga-san, would you like to say a few lines?
Thank you. Yes, it's already time to close, so I'd like to be very brief. I have been working with Mr. de Graaf for a long time, and so we are on the same page. And between the EU and Japan, yes, let's come up with the concrete projects. Let's create lighthouse kind of project between the EU and Japan. And for that purpose, I wanted to invite Professor Miyata today for this session. So having said that, we have the tech team, the public-private cooperation, and next year, World Economic Forum. Together with the forum, Global Tech Governance Summit is going to be held. We are hoping to have a physical event for that. And for such initiative, data-free flow with trust, and the participants here today need to also take part in such initiative. If we are to have lighthouse project between the EU and Japan, we need to have participation from the private sector. So let's have more of such opportunity like today, and let's get involved, the private sector people, to have concrete actions. That is my message today. Thank you.
Next, Mr. Ivo Bowman, would you like to give your concluding remark?
Yes, thanks. And many thanks for the seminar. It's been very interesting. So I would just like to say, let's continue working together on data governance, on new technologies, and also new ways of extracting value out of data, right? And on the data infrastructure is very important also. Now, what we want is to shape a new data economy built on values, and actually to create an alternative for the current models of exploiting data that are a bit one-sided. So I would be very happy to further discuss all these issues also offline.
Thank you. And Mr. Tege, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, just to mention that the public headwind for digital policy, as I would call it, this will not last long. Let's keep the momentum, and probably we only have 12 months to build this lighthouse project, and I think SAP on both sides, both here in the EU and in Japan, we would be happy to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Miyata Sensei, would you like to deliver a concluding message?
もう EU の皆さんの考え方、先ほどデグラフ
Yes,
さん
I am also on the same page. As Mr. De Graaf said, we need to create new value. We have to co-create new value.
データを独占して富を独占するっていう時代は、終わったと。
To have exclusive possession of wealth and data, that time is over. And EU is now trying to create such co-creation of data framework. So let's utilize the data as public goods in order to create a new form of democracy. I'm sure that we have the same sense of value. And I have great respect for all the participants today. So I do hope to work together on some concrete project. And all of the participants here today, let's co-create together going forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd like to close this webinar by saying that, by repeating my first line, Japan and the EU are essential partners. There's not one country that I believe that was not impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of persons infected, deaths, pressures on public health systems, and a slowdown in the economy. It's a challenging time for all nations around the globe, but it's a turning point and an opportunity for Japan and EU to accelerate cooperation. I apologize that we were not able to address all the questions from the audience, but I hope everybody had something to take away from today's webinar. Next webinar, COVID-19 and international trade, is on July 9th, next Thursday at the same time. We have 602, I believe, people registered for this webinar today, which is amazing. Thank you to all the speakers and staff, and thank you to the audience for listening in. We wish you a wonderful rest of the day and a wonderful evening. Thank you.